Hey there, everybody. It's Eternal Snowman here for another episode. Well, not really another, but I wanted to do my Uber's viability rankings post UPL, and it's just going to be this is going to be like my other one, a two-parter. The first one will be going through everything in A minus rank and above, so S plus S, A plus A, and A minus. And the second video will be going through the rest of the Pokemon that I've ranked, which go down to C minus, and that video will be a little bit it'll while we're going through more mons, it'll be a little bit less in depth because a lot of those mons at the lower end are less viable, so they don't really need have as much discussion. And so when that video comes out, you can just search it up. And yeah, so the first how I'm going to go through this is it's going to be ranked in S plus, like essentially rankings. It's very similar to how most viability rankings work on Smogon, and it's going to be ranked in order, so it's not like everything within the same tier is going to be different. It's actually the fact that, or sorry, everything in the same tier would be the same rank viability. In fact, it's that it's ranked in order, and then the different tiers pretty much just represent how impactful those set of mons are. So here, like for example, I believe Xerneas is the best mon in Ubers right now, and then Primal Kyogre is the second best, and then there's a difference between the second, first, top two, and the third, fourth, and fifth, and then third, fourth, and fifth, and then like the rest here. So I'll essentially just jump into the rankings. And to start it off is Xerneas. So most people would say that these top five here are the same, but probably in a different order. Like I feel like a lot of people might even rank it exactly opposite of how I have. And the reason why I think Xerneas is the best Pokemon in this tier is not necessarily because of its impact directly, but more so due to its invisible impact through the it has two primary metagame defining sets, both of which I believe I think Scarf Xerneas is the best current set in the entire tier, and it's I feel like a must include on many teams because it's the best form of speed control in the current metagame. Um, without like that's not priority, and also it provides an insane amount of utility while also providing an insane matchup versus a lot of teams, especially offense that struggles very much with Xerneas. The second set is Geozern. While it has fallen off significantly since its introduction and is no longer the threat that it used to be, it is still a premier set for Xerneas and has sweeping potential similar to many other Pokemon within this top tier set, and it can dent unprepared teams, and if not played around properly, it can be very dangerous. However, that set has taken a hit recently because of um, Pokemon like Duskmane and Primal Groudon being introduced into the tier, mainly Duskmane in Ultra Sun and Moon. But Xerneas, you can still win with that set because offensive Duskmane is not exactly the most amazing Xerneas Geozern check, and teams have been slacking on checking Zern because of how many Pokemon need to be checked in the current meta. There's also a few other sets Xerneas can run to varying degrees of success, one being Z-Geo, which can be really good against unprepared offense teams. However, it's more of a niche pick and can't always be relied upon. Specs Zern is very good against bulky teams. However, in many cases, you actually want the Scarf over the Specs, even though Specs has so much power. Scarf Zern is actually almost just as good in many cases. However, Specs Zern is a good pick against people who tend to run soft fairy checks. For example, if you like your Magirnas and your Primal Groudons, and that's your primary Xerneas checks, that can be a very good way to exploit those because while Scarf Zern can do it as well, it's a little bit of a slower process, and Spec Zern can really abuse you using these softer checks. Uh, and then the last set is CM with some sort of Z move, or Pixie Plate, or these all-out attacking sets, or defensive. These are like more niche sets that can be used to exploit certain weaknesses. For example, defensive is really good against Stall because of its ability to Aroma and its ability to use Shed Shell reliably as opposed to other defensive fairy types. It can also be used on stall as an anti-stall tech for stall. And also Z move, CM Z move is pretty good against breaking, once again, softer checks. It can be good for breaking like Ho-Oh, for example, without having to commit to Geo, because it can find opportunities to attack without having to fully commit. And then the last one is Pixie Play, which is pretty much just an anti-stall tech if you're really scared of stall. And so why do I put Xerneas above the other Pokemon within the tier? I believe Xerneas is really good and the metagame defining Pokemon because of its effect, mainly because of its ability to, its Scarf to set to run, like the amount of supportive pressure that it brings because Aroma I believe is one of the best moves in the current meta, and that's why one of the biggest reasons why it's so good because of its ability to run Aroma without really losing anything, and can win a lot of matchups simply by itself. And the reason why I take it over Pokemon like Duskmane and Primal Groudon, who can fulfill potentially more roles in the case of Primal Groudon, or has a single set that maybe has a lot more direct impact with its with Duskmane's Double Dance set, is that Xerneas can be run in tandem with these Pokemon, and uh, it doesn't really have team building restrictions because running it gives you so much like power in the like, unlike Duskmane, who like if you're running the offensive Duskmane set, it actually doesn't have that much defensive utility outside of being a toxic immunity, but then you want to keep it healthy so it doesn't really come in on a lot of toxic mons. And then it also is a Xerneas check, however it's not super like good. It's like a soft Xerneas check, while its defensive sets may be a good Xerneas check. It also is generally bait for a lot of other Pokemon like Primal Groudon and stuff like that. So Xerneas provides a lot in a single slot without having to sacrifice anything. Primal Kyogre is chosen as the second best mon and separated above the other three mons in the top 5 because of its ability to run 3 really, really amazing sets. While I don't think any of the single sets are metagame defining, I think they're all so good that it creates an inability to really check Primal Kyogre. The 3 sets is defensive, or defensive, mixed, and CM, sub CM / just CM3 attacks. And the reason why Primal Kyogre is so good is because it only has one real check with a real counter within the metagame, and every team in the metagame that is not running that one mon, which is Ferrothorn, is very weak to Primal Kyogre. And it's really hard to be able to beat it without like pretty much just trading one for one. On like the worst it does is against offense because its bulk is mediocre at best, and I would say that the Rest Hawk defensive set is even pretty decent against offense as well. However, against other sets, against like mixed ogre is pretty mediocre against offense, but at worst you're still going to be trading one for one, and it provides so much offensive utility and a decent amount of defensive utility that it exudes so much pressure that you have to kill it, and that's a priority. So like it won't be able, like nothing can really set up on it. An example of why it can be good is like it can pressure things like Duskmane pretty easily and can be an offensive check to Duskmane, while the defensive one is a defensive check to Duskmane. The defensive set is really good because it exudes a lot of offensive pressure, even though it's a defensive mon and it's really bulky, because unboosted Scald, or like uninvested Scald, still does like a million damage, and pretty much every single Scald resist in the tier, except for except for like refresh Arceus forms. Refresh CM Arceus forms are actually like a decent counter to that set specifically. And Ferrothorn. And Ferrothorn doesn't really appreciate being burned. So Primal Kyogre is really good in that sense. And then the other sets is it can bypass a lot of its counters. Toxic hitting the Pedon, which puts it on a timer. You have the like Mix Ogre, it can hit Toxic on its major counters, while Earthquake on Primal Groudon, and it just hits really hard with its Water Stab with Liquidation, or with Origin Pulse in the case of Sub CM, and Sub CM can bypass non-Grass Stab, Ferrothorn, as well as a bunch of its other counters, which, like for example, non-Confined Blissey, which would be a counter to Special Kyogre, is actually bypassed because of Sub, and like that kind of stuff. So Primal Kyogre just has so much pressure. It's amazing versus stall, really good against balanced teams, decent against offense, and the thing is that's most scary about it is that you don't know what set it can run. And all three of its major sets, well, more so I would say the defensive and the Mix Ogre set, are provide so much pressure, and it requires like a lot of resources to be able to take it down. And it's also like naturally pretty bulky on the special side, so it takes on most of the support Arceus forms pretty easily, and most of the physical attackers are still scared of it because of the offensive pressure. And like for example, a mon like Marshadow, which is a strong physical attacker, can't even 1v1 it because it will actually die. It won't be able to OHKO, and then it'll get OHKO'd back by pretty much every single move, except I think it takes like 80 something from Scald, which is still like a ton. So it can't really like freely CC because if it close combats, then it dies. So Yveltal is chosen as the next mon in this, which is once again, I know, a little bit weird that I have Duskmane and Pedon as the 4th and 5th mons instead of most people would say top 2, 3-ish mons. But I think Yveltal is another one of those mons where it has a lot of roles in the metagame, and each of its different sets you have to treat very differently. And I think Yveltal, out of all of these mons, is the one that has the most flexibility because of its, unlike the other mons, it can run a Z move very successfully, and it can lure all of its, well, not all, but many of its counters pretty easily with stuff like Z Flyinium, and most of Yveltal checks are actually like soft Yveltal checks because they don't like, Yveltal doesn't really have like a pure sweeping set like Xerneas or Duskmane or Primal Groudon, so many people opt not to use a really hard Yveltal check and instead use something like Scarf Zern as their primary Yveltal check, which like Z Flyinium can be really threatening. Stuff like Knockoff provides a lot of pressure. It's quite good defensively, and Sucker Punch is super good in this metagame because of Duskmane and Primal Groudon being very popular, and Sucker Punch being a great way to revenge them. I think its primary sets are Life Orb, Scarf, Specs, Black Glasses, both Darkinium and Flyinium are quite good, and defensive is pretty good in this current meta as well. And just all those sets are quite amazing in their own right, and each one can be fit on teams pretty easily because Yveltal provides a lot of defensive utility, unlike a lot of the other mons. I think Primal Groudon provides the most defensive utility out of any sort of mon in the top 5. However, Yveltal provides a lot of defensive utility with the added benefit of offensively pressuring stuff like Necrozma and not really having a lot of safe switch-ins. So that's what puts it really high. Also, it's notable that it's the best mon at running U-turn, and I think U-turn is so good in this current meta, especially with different things that are able to trap, and also just providing a lot of momentum, especially against stall and stuff like that. And I think Yveltal being able to use U-turn and taunt, these two moves that are amazing utility moves, put it really far ahead of some of the competition. And that's why I put it so high, because I believe it's that, like, those moves are so good. And the reason why I separate Yveltal and Primal Kyogre in different tiers is because I feel like Primal Kyogre provides so much pressure, and its defensive set is so good. Yveltal's defensive set is actually not as good, so you really only have to deal with it offensively. And some of the counters I think are relatively easy to build in, and it doesn't hard counter anything. It just offensively pressures a lot of stuff. So stuff like Primal Groudon can actually beat Yveltal 1v1 despite Yveltal generally being considered like a Primal Groudon check. Kind of lowers Yveltal's value a little bit. Duskmane comes in next, probably one of the most infamous Pokemon that was introduced in Ultra Sun and Moon, or like just recently, and it's because of Solgaleo Z also being introduced at the same time, and it has a ridiculous sweeping set with its Double Dance set. And the reason why it's not higher, as I kind of went through it earlier, that it has problems that its offensive set isn't as defensive as you would like, and its defensive set isn't as offensive as you would like, and so you can't really reach a middle ground, but it's able to break a lot of its checks and counters really easily, which is one of the things that's really scary about it. It kind of is like another Geozern in that sense, however, it doesn't have the same utility that a Scarf Xerneas could have, and that's why it's not like a Xerneas. However, I do think that its Double Dance set is probably one of, well, actually, I think it is the biggest current threat in the metagame in terms of what sweeping wise. I think it's actually better than Geozern by a decent amount because of its ability to break a lot of its own checks and counters, while Xerneas cannot bypass some of its hard counters. Duskmane does have a few of these hard counters, however, these hard counters are pretty much like not viable by themselves. Whereas in Xerneas' case, there are hard counters that are viable without like that do stuff outside of just checking Xerneas. Like Duskmane's main counters are like Skarmory, which like is terrible outside of use, and like Arceus Water, which I think is kind of suboptimal because it loses to like every single other mon within the top 5, because it loses to Xerneas, it loses to most forms of Primal Kyogre, it loses to Yveltal, and it kind of checks Primal Groudon depending on the set, but I'm assuming you're running like Wisp Judgment or something like that, and so Primal Groudon can still pressure it. And then lastly is Primal Groudon that rounds off the top 5. I think this is kind of a weird pick because it has so many amazing sets, with the Spadef set being so good, and the Double Dance and mixed RP sets, while there's offensive Stealth Rocks as well. I do think Primal Groudon has gotten worse recently. First off, I'll say that while it does beat like a bunch of the Pokemon in the top 5, one of its main problems is that it will actually be used as a primary defensive backbone for teams, and it can be easily exploited because it has to check so many stuff and it can only really check one thing. So while it can check both, it can check Xerneas, it can check Primal Kyogre, it can check Duskmane, it can't really check Yveltal, but it can check all of these Pokemon. However, if it has to switch into them repeatedly, it can easily be chipped down and exploited pretty easily because it doesn't really run a lot of recovery options. The recent Overheat tech is cool, however, it also makes it kind of a setup bait in after using the Overheat. And more Primal Groudon has been exploited recently with stuff like Zygarde and Arceus Ground becoming better and better in the current meta, making Primal Groudon a little bit worse than it was before. And so that's why I put it so low. However, it does provide a lot of defensive utility, especially if you're running offensive sets. It's one of the best defensive utility for hyper offense teams. It also provides a lot of sweeping pressure with a lot of lack of fire resists recently outside of Zygarde and potentially Arceus Water. However, Arceus Water I think is not okay. It wasn't as popular as it was in ORAS, but it has been gaining a little bit popularity recently. I do think that Primal Groudon, it has gotten a little bit worse. However, I still would say it is a top 5 mon, and the top 5 I think are a little like a good amount ahead of the rest of the mons. So the difference between the 5th best mon, which is Primal Groudon, and the 6th best mon, I think, is very, very big. And it's really hard to, I think the 6 through 6, 7, 8, and 9 here in A plus are all very close in terms of viability, and they provide a lot of different things to teams. Well, all of these mons can run, and the reason why they're in S is because they can run many different sets very, very well. So Xerneas running, as I mentioned before, like the 4 or 5 sets. The Primal Kyogre running 3 primary sets that are very good. Yveltal running like 9 different amazing sets. Necrozma runs like 2 or 3 really, really good sets, and then like a few others that are like fringe sets that can be used as niche options. And then Primal Groudon with its like 4 or 5 amazing sets. And I think the reason why I rate Primal Groudon lower than stuff like Necrozma or Yveltal is I don't think any one of its sets is actually metagame defining. The Spadef set is really, really amazing. However, it's really reactionary to some of the other Pokemon that have been gaining popularity, like Necrozma. And I can't rate a Pokemon that is good for checking something above it as better than the Pokemon above it, right? So while its Spadef set is really amazing and can be used to check Necrozma, it can't really be put ahead of Necrozma because Necrozma is actually like the reason why it's good, right? So moving on to the A plus tier, Zygarde. I think this is relatively self-explanatory. In UPL, it has an amazing win rate. The reason why it's not higher and not higher than stuff like Yveltal or Necrozma or whatever, the stuff that people would generally say, well, some people might say Yveltal is actually worse than Zygarde, or like Xerneas is worse than Zygarde or whatever it is. I think Zygarde, while it is very good, it is actually quite weak in terms of its sweeping set, and it relies a lot on stuff like toxic spikes, which means you have to run it with a suboptimal partner, or like para spam, and then it relying on paras, which is like not super good. And it's not super strong by itself, so in a lot of matchups, if you don't actually get the right chip on the opposing mons, then it's actually really hard for it to sweep, because it doesn't really offensively pressure a lot of the mons that it needs to, because it's only base 100 attack. And unlike the other mons, its primary set, which has gotten so much usage and so much success, is its Dragon Dance set, with a few variations on how it's run, with like between the sub protect for toxic spikes or the glare with sub, and or like Dragon Tail and whatever it is. But Zygarde still can't run other sets very successfully. Its other set, which is defensive, I think is really easily exploited and has a lot of weaknesses. So like Zygarde, while it's good, it also has a 4 times weakness to ice, and ice is a very, very common type to use in Ubers, and also has a weakness to both Fairy and Dragon. And while it has amazing physical bulk, its special bulk is somewhat lackluster and can be exploited by all these types, since all the types I mentioned are generally run as special moves. So while it can be good, it has a lot of common checks and counters, and also like its defensive utility can often be negated because it runs into problems against stuff that runs like common lures slash like other like coverage moves to be able to bypass it. So while it's good, and I definitely think that it has gotten a lot better recently and has the potential to become even better in the future, it does have problems, which is that if you're running offensive sets, it doesn't break its counter. It's not super offensive. It's kind of weak, and at the same time, it doesn't have the most defensive utility, but it definitely is very good. Mega Gengar has no real explanation. It's really amazing against pretty much every team. It can trade 1-for-1. It can do whatever it needs to, and Mega Gengar hasn't really improved or like gotten worse recently. It's pretty much just up to the user as to how good Mega Gengar can be. It has a really high ceiling and can put in work in some matchups that pretty much like can 6-0 some matchups because of how good it is, because it can eliminate certain mons. However, it has a lot of counterplay. It needs a turn to Mega Evolve, which it makes it not easy, but it makes it exploitable. and to trap stuff, and it's also not super strong. So if you just run a bunch of mons that can 1v1 Mega Gengar, which honestly isn't that hard, then it can be pretty dead weight in some matchups. However, the fact that it has Shadow Tag and ability gives it a huge boon. So even though it's weak and it's frail and doesn't have the most amazing defensive typing, and its offensive typing is for Ubers, and it doesn't really provide any sort of defensive utility or whatever it is, the fact that it can trap weakened stuff, it can trap Xerneas, it can trap a bunch of like mons, gives it so much pressure because trapping is so broken. And that's pretty much the only reason why it's good. Marshadow is next. I think Marshadow has gotten better recently because people have gotten more lax about checking it. Stuff like Arceus Ferry has dropped in popularity a little bit because of Gothitelle and stuff like that. And Marshadow has been creeping up in the meta. While I do think it is Scarf Zern and is like one of the main reasons why it's not in the higher ranks, it has gotten a little bit better because its offensive pressure and offense in general has been running around more, and Marshadow does like that in general. So that makes it a little bit better. Obviously, there's no reason. It only really runs one successful set and then like one other fringe set, which is the bulk up Z move set. But mostly its best set is the Life Orb for attacks, and it can run Pursue, HP Ice, or Rock Tomb in that last slot, and it can be quite successful, but can also be dead weight in some matchups that you just can't really use it for because they have a primary check to it, and then it just gets chipped down pretty easily. And that's one of its main problems. It doesn't really have answers to chip, and its defensive utility is like pretty being like an E-killer check is pretty much the only thing that it really has going for it. It can sponge like one defensive hit, but it's not super good at or like one hit from like a defensive mon like Arceus or Zygarde or something like that, but it's not super good at doing that, and it's easily chipped out. But it is still really good against offense, and Metatrends have been supporting it, especially if you're running HP Ice Marshadow, because Zygarde is more and more popular, and that is one thing that is in its favor. As opposed to like prior hard counters like Arceus Ferry. Arceus Ground, I think, has been kind of losing a lot of popularity recently for reasons I can't really tell. I think it's still the best support Arceus form outside of the fact that it loses to Gothitelle. You can run stuff like Magic Code or whatever it is to bypass that, but Arceus Ground is still amazing. It still checks Primal Groudon. It now is a soft check to Duskmane. It still is a soft check to Yveltal. And the reason why I put it lower than I normally would have for Arceus Ground, which is the best support Arceus form, is the fact that Primal Kyogre is so good in this current meta, and Primal Kyogre can exploit it pretty easily, both the defensive and the other forms are like pretty easily exploited. Pretty easily exploit Arceus Ground and can then result in your team being quite weak to Kyogre. But Arceus Ground does do a good job at checking a lot of the things that are good in the meta, like Zygarde. It checks Zygarde, Mega Gengar, Marshadow, Primal Groudon, kind of Duskmane, kind of Yveltal. Can serve as a decent answer to a lot of these Pokemon, and it's just a good mon to bring against just for solid balance, and it provides a good defensive core. Now moving on to the A rank, I believe there's only two Pokemon that I ranked here, and that is Giratina Origin and Arceus Ferry. So Giratina Origin has one main set that really makes it successful, and that is its defensive set with offensive defensive defog set. I don't really know how to describe it, but it's the one with that runs defense and either a special move or a physical set. Generally, the physical set has fallen out of favor recently. It was really good in the Evo Pass era, but now you are running the special set or a mixed set with something like Shadow Ball, Draco Meteor, and Shadow Sneak, or something like Hex, Status, and Draco Meteor. These sets are good because Giratina Origin provides a pretty decent check to Duskmane. And also, I should mention that one reason why Marshadow is pretty good is because its ability to run Shadow Sneak as priority to disrupt and help check Duskmane. Giratina Origin Shadow Sneak does something similar. It is also a primary check to Primal Groudon and can answer a lot of other Pokemon that are very good. It can be a secondary check to stuff like Primal Kyogre if need be, and stuff like it can be a one-time check to stuff like Mega Gengar or Mega or Marshadow, or other just like other mons because of its natural bulk. It's also notably useful as a ghost type offensive mon because of its ability to pressure a lot of the ghost primary checks so that stuff like Gengar, stuff like Marshadow can sweep better. For example, it can try to bait in Yveltal and Draco it for free, or it can bait in Xerneas and get a free Shadow Ball and chip those things like that way. Its main weakness is the fact that it doesn't really answer a lot of stuff like support Arceus and has weaknesses to both Yveltal and Xerneas, which is like very bad in one slot because it has a lot of team building restrictions. But its ability to defog on a lot of the common rockers outside of Arceus Ferry does give it a boon, and that's like its main strength and its ability to answer a lot of Pokemon like one time. Arceus Ferry comes in next, and the reason why it's so good right now is because of its ability to set rocks against pretty much every single hazard remover that is currently within the metagame, with Mega Sableye, Giratina Origin, and it can set against Arceus Ground if you're running Toxic, and it can run different moves to be able to bypass a lot of its counters, like Stone Edge for Ho-Oh, Fire Blast for Ferrothorn, and it makes a very good offensive pairing with Xerneas because a lot of Fairy checks will want to also switch, or like a lot of Xerneas checks are like primary Fairy resists that want to switch into Arceus Fairy can then be weakened for Xern later down the road. Stuff like Earth Power and Fire Blast beating its Xerneas' checks, and then it's able to then pressure these mons away and to the point where Xern can actually just clean them up. And then it can also set rocks as well. So it's two primary sets, the offensive rocker set and then the defensive set, which can either rock or defog. The offensive set is very good. It's one of the best rockers in the game and one of the better pressure mons in the game for pressure offense. And its defensive set is like kind of able to be taken advantage of. I think it's a lot worse. The offensive set is very good. And is very good to be paired with Xern, and that's like its main boon. Arceus Water is next. It's very good for checking Necrozma, Duskmane, and it is probably the reason why. Duskmane is probably the reason why it has risen a lot in popularity and success. And the other Pokemon that it does check in the top tiers is Zygarde, as well as being a soft check, like a decent secondary check to Primal Groudon. It can actually can switch in and toxic it, but Swords Dance Primal Groudon will actually generally beat Arceus Water, making it like an primary check. But it does answer it, and it does answer a bunch of other stuff like Mix Ogre decently and other stuff like that. And it's just a general good blanket check to the meta. WoW can be taken advantage of because you have to choose between running Judgment, which is a water stab, and Ubers, which is not super good. Outside of Primal Kyogre, which is the only one who can really run it because of how strong Primal Kyogre is and its ability to reset the weather with its ability if it switches into Primal Groudon. Primary Water Stab is really an Ubers, but if you choose to run Ice Beam over Judgment, then a lot of mons can actually take advantage of you because your Ice Beam is just so weak. So it is kind of one of the most passive Pokemon in Ubers, or it can be one of the most passive Pokemon in Ubers. However, it does have the boon of being one of the best defoggers in the tier as well, answering a lot of the offensive rock setters, and just like in general rock setters pretty well. It is, however, susceptible to status like a lot of other mons, but in general pretty good because of its ability to check Duskman. Ultra Necrozma, a Pokemon that I believe has a lot of potential. Um, it's really been seeing a lot of success on offense and mainly Web's offense. And it's really, really, really strong. It's just amazingly strong. It has two primary sets: the Calm Mind set and the Swords Dance set. The Swords Dance set is very strong, running Edgequake, Swords Dance, and Photon Geyser. It can break through almost all of Duskmane's primary counters, which is the reason why you would ever run it, because you would go from Duskmane, they would switch into the primary counter, while you Swords Dance, you Ultra Form, and then you blow them away, and it's also fast. However, its main problem is that it's easily checked with a lot of Pokemon. Once you Ultra Form, it actually becomes very vulnerable, because then it's beaten by a lot of common stuff, or outsped and beaten by a lot of common stuff, like Scarf Xerneas, Scarf Yveltal, Mars Shadow. While not outsped, you actually get you kill with Sneak, and then Mega Gengar, you're trapped and you die, so that's really bad. But it does provide a lot of offensive pressure against slower teams, and stuff like if they sack their Xerneas, thinking that you're a Duskmane, because Xerneas won't be that good in that matchup, then you have the possibility to Ultra and clean their team. Rayquaza is next. It's an underrated mon that's really, really good against balance and slower teams, and also provides extreme speed to clean up versus a lot of offensive teams. Its main problem is its defensive capabilities and its inability to break a lot of the support Arceus forms, mainly Arceus Groudon, Arceus Water, Arceus Ferry, as the notable ones. And while it's good, it does have problems. Its susceptibility to chip, especially if it's running Life Orb. The fact that you have to, or you're going to get chipped, as well as you from Life Orb and Stealth Rocks, make it a little bit worse. And also its lack of defensive utility. Its ability to switch into Primal Groudon is nice. However, it still fears the offensive sets of Primal Groudon. Its offensive prowess is one of the best in the tier. I would say it's the second best pure wall breaker in the tier after Yveltal. And it also has the ability to run a sweeping set, which can be threatening, which is its DD set, which can run Life Orb or Z move, making it kind of flexible, or like even Sash or that kind of stuff. Rayquaza is really good at breaking a lot of its checks and counters, especially stuff like Sash sets can bypass Arceus, support Arceus form. So for an example, you would bring it in on a weakened Primal Groudon, but you would bring it in on something like a weakened Ho-Oh, and then they would want to preserve their Ho-Oh, so they switch out, and then they go to Arceus. As you Swords Dance, you Dragon Ascent on their Ice Beam, and your Sash is popped, but you live, and then they're at like, they take like 80 something, and then you Extreme Speed to finish them off, so you actually bypass your counter. Rayquaza also undoubtedly hits a relatively good speed tier because of its ability to outspeed Primal Groudon, and also has access to extreme speed, which is pretty much what it's really good for against offense, while its defensive, or like its wall breaking potential against defensive teams is very good. Ferrothorn is next. I think it's a pretty underrated mon in the current meta. Its ability to check Primal Kyogre is really amazing, as well as just blanket check a lot of different things. Stuff like Mega Metagross is pretty hard stop by Arceus Water, Primal Kyogre, some Zern sets. It can even serve as a secondary check to Yveltal. It can be a secondary check to some Giratina Origin sets. Can check Arceus Ferry if not for Fire Blast, and other stuff like that. And its ability to set spikes makes it a very, like, well, it may seem like a passive mon, it has a threat because it will set spikes in free turns that you give it. And it's also relatively hard to kill for something that doesn't actually get a 50% recovery move, because of its ability to leech seed and offensively pressure that way through passive damage. Its main problem, however, is that it's really susceptible to Leers, and it's also a momentum sink in many cases, because there's a lot of offensive Pokemon that do like just kind of take advantage of it. And also because it's a slot that is a fairy resist that doesn't beat Geozern, which is a problem for many teams, because you can't really beat a fairy resist that doesn't beat Geozern, because teams can't afford to be running multiple slots that lose to Primal Groudon, since most Xerneas answers are also weak to Primal Groudon. So that's one of its main problems. Next up is Ho-Oh. Ho-Oh, while is very good, and especially good in Ultra Sun and Moon because of the increase of Pokemon that are able to hazard clear for it. It does have problems because it can't really offensively pressure a lot of Pokemon without the use of Toxic, and I think Toxic has gotten a little bit worse with Xerneas being so prevalent, Scarf Xerneas being so prevalent. But it also does check Scarf Xerneas, which is notable. However, being able, a lot of stuff like pressure offense, which I believe is one of the best playstyles in the current meta, pressure offense really Ho does really nothing against those types of playstyles, and stuff like Marshadow and Zygarde being more popular is worse for Ho-Oh because it can't really do a lot of the stuff that it wants to do. Its primary sets are defensive, Life Orb, and Band, which all of which can be taken advantage of in some way easily. Its defog defensive set is good, but it can be trapped unless you're running attack investment and Life Orb. And its primary place in teams is either on balance or on stall because of their ability to actually hazard clear for it. But Ho is also susceptible to a lot of lures, and also is a switch in for Primal. Well, like Primal Kyogre can exploit a lot of Ho teams pretty easily as well. It is very good for the things that it can do well, but it's a polarizing mon in terms of it can do a lot of things really well, but it can also be taken advantage of in many ways as well. Mega Metagross is probably the most surprising pick out of anything here, and out of the A ranks. And why I give Mega Metagross such a high spot in this tier list is because, or like in this viability rankings, is because I believe Mega Metagross is one of the best Pokemon for pressure offense. I kind of mentioned this earlier. Pressure offense, I believe, is one of the best playstyles in the current meta, with stuff like you have a Stealth Rock's offensive Arceus form, with stuff like Xerneas, Yveltal, Duskmane, Primal Groudon, and then maybe a Mega Metagross, or maybe like a Rayquaza, or like a something like along those, like a Marshadow along those lines. What does Mega Metagross bring to these teams? First off, it really benefits from Stealth Rock since many of its checks and counters are heavily pressured by rocks, and also it's very good at pressuring a lot of defensive cores, and also provides a lot of defensive utility in one slot. Its ability to check stuff like Scarf Zern and Geo Zern in one slot on an offensive team is very nice, as well as stuff like Rayquaza, like like Arceus Ferry is nice, and also it provides a lot of offensive pressure. Depending on the set it runs, which is probably its biggest boon, is that it can bypass almost all of its counters in some way by running some sort of different move in its set, whether that be a Toxic, Thunder Punch for Ho-Oh, Thunder Punch for Ho-Oh and Primal Kyogre, Earthquake for Primal Groudon, Ice Punch for Zygarde, and Mega Ments and that kind of stuff. It has a lot of flexibility, so it can be tailor-made to different teams, and it can also be used as a lure, which is one of the most important things for pressure offense, to be able to lure different mons for for different threats, which is the reason why I rank it so high. And people would almost definitely disagree with my placing of Mega Metagross being so high. However, I would say to those people who have not, who did disagree with me, to try using it a little bit, and maybe you might see what the brilliance of Mega Metagross really is. It's amazing versus stall because of toxic immunity, and also provides a lot of defensive utility on teams that don't really have a good defensive backbone, and can be a really good team building option to be able to actually use a lot of these things that to use a lot of these tools that some teams um, want to use, like because they want to have like Xerneas and Yveltal, but those teams can't also need a Xerneas check. So Mega Metagross can often fit in there, and also it inevitably it's going to be compared a lot to Duskmane, and the reason why you would ever run it over Duskmane is because of its immediate offensive pressure. It doesn't really need to set up, and while they don't really share the same set of counters, because Mega Metagross actually relies on a lot on its coverage to bypass its counters, whereas Duskmane just relies on its sheer power. Mega Metagross can't really compete with Duskmane in terms of sheer power. While they're, I think Mega Metagross is stronger. Mega Metagross is actually stronger unboosted, which is the reason why it's so good, and it also has a plethora of coverage, and also its speed tier is very relevant for taking advantage of these things. And as access to Bullet Punch makes priority is pretty relevant in the current metagame because it's just so good at being able to check a lot of these mons that otherwise would be hard to check because of how fast they are. Lenola is another Pokemon similar to Mega Metagross, very strong on pressure offense, and even has appearances on balance. It provides some defensive utility because of Shadow Shield. However, it's really hard to really keep hazards off in the current meta on the teams that Lenola appears on. However, what it's really good at is breaking support CS and defensive cores because of its CM set that takes advantage of certain mons, and it doesn't really have a lot of switch-ins. Stuff like Ho-Oh, Ferrothorn, like Arceus Water, Arceus Ferry, that are like part of defensive cores can often be exploited by Lenola and then set up on and subsequently used as fodder for them to set up on, and then eventually Z-move something that will die. And it's very strong. It can serve as a secondary check to Duskmane and a primary check to Duskmane on offensive teams. Actually, if you can keep hazards off in some way, Lenola can be a decent check to that, as well as just being so strong with menacing Moonrays. Z move for Moon. Yes, Beam. I don't even know what it's called. It's just like some stupid like long name, but it is very good at breaking a lot of balanced cores, and that is because it just has like a lot of sheer power. And as you'll notice, ghost resist aren't very common. In fact, there's actually one ghost resist in the A that I put in the A ranks. Well, you'll see Darkseus a little bit lower, but ghost resists aren't very common in Ubers. They're kind of hard to come by. And so its power really derives from that, and its like ability to set up on a large plethora of mons. Gothitelle rounds out the A- ranking with kind of as a requirement. I put it up here, even though I don't actually think it's this good because everyone has been prepping for Gothitelle. And there's so many different ways to stop Gothitelle. However, it has a huge restriction on team building. Pokemon like Ferrothorn, Pokemon like Celesteela, defensive Ho-Oh, support CS, stuff that like Arceus Water and Arceus Ferry and Arceus Ground, even defensive Zygarde, Lugia, stuff like this. It traps a huge plethora of mons, and it can completely destroy defensive cores because of it. However, there are different ways to bypass it. For example, you can run stuff like Magic Coat on your Arceus forms, or you can run Dragon Tail on your Lugia, or stuff like that. And so you have to choose to not be weak to Gothitelle. However, in the matchups that it's good in, it can be completely disgusting. For example, you're relying on Ferrothorn to be your primary Primal Kyogre check, and you don't really have a water resist. Maybe you choose not to go Primal Groudon on that team because you have Ferrothorn and you want some sort of other pressure. And so they trap your Ferrothorn with Gothitelle, and then you're just done because Kyogre just completely runs through your team, and then you can't really do anything about it because Gothitelle is just, that's like the power of Gothitelle, because you don't really have, like in the matches that it succeeds in, it can just completely destroy you and there's nothing you can do about it. So that was a really long video actually, and I want to thank Sanjay for being able to help me make this graphic for the tier list or viability rankings, and thanks everyone for watching, and I hope you guys enjoyed, and you'll tune into my next episode where we break down the remaining Pokemon, including some Pokemon that I actually really enjoy, like Tyranitar, like Mega Venusaur, Dialga, and that kind of stuff. So if you're looking forward to that, look forward to my next video. on the viability rankings. And thank you so much for watching. And that's it. Bye bye.